Hello, everybody. How are you? Yes, still good. More spread out. Isn't this a better room anyway? It's good. And we've got a slide that you can actually see. Isn't it fantastic? Okay, my second presentation is about pragmatic strategies to legitimize implementation of sustainable transport in cities. By the way, this is a picture of a city, and this is not sustainable transport. This is called traffic congestion. It's dominating. It might as well be any of your streets in Seoul, or even outside in Jeju City. Very, very congested. In this traffic stream, there are two buses carrying more people than all the other cars involved there. It doesn't make any sense to do that. It's very inefficient, and we should be trying to give priority to some vehicles which carry more people. It's called common sense. It's good transport planning. But it's not what happens in cities. So, to introduce this presentation concerns the use of pragmatic strategies to legitimize implementation of planning in cities. It's how to get sustainable transport done. It is the PhD project of Dr. James Reynolds, who's a research fellow in my group. It's how to get sustainable transport projects done in cities in the real world of political, institutional, and public opposition. Yes, I hope you're all feeling queasy now, because I'm going to take you into the real world. You can all write your research science reports and so forth, but what happens in the real world is about politics. It's about local area traders, local residents complaining about things. That's how you really get things to happen. That's what I'm going to talk about. This is a joint PhD project with industry. This is the team, included Professor Jeff Rose and Alistair Cumming. He's our industry supervisor. Alistair is with Vic Roads, the road authority. They were very interested in this project. And it's all available online. I'll show you the links later on. I'm going to talk about the context of this research. I'm going to talk a bit about what's called legitimacy. I think a lot of this will be new to you all, but this is the real world of how you implement things. And it's very useful for researchers to be aware of it. From the work, we generated a new set of ideas called pragmatic strategies. It's a way of going about transport planning, which helps you get delivery of outcomes. Then I'll close off. The context is that I have published vast amounts of research on trying to get buses and trams into traffic to get priority. We've published in all the leading journals. There probably wouldn't be many other researchers on planet Earth has published as much as we have on the topic of improving science and engineering to optimize the design of priority for buses and trams in traffic. This is bus priority or tram priority, very much like the bus lanes I saw in Seoul, which have been put in the center of roads. There's some of it here on some of the electric bus routes. I would say we've created a lot of new knowledge. I'm going to just talk a little bit about some of the innovations we've done in this area. We meta-studied all the evidence there was from providing bus lanes in cities, and this is some of the evidence graphics. This is the at-grade bus lanes, segregated bus lanes, and grade-separated bus lanes. The types of benefits that were measured were on average around about 21% for at-grade, up to 46% travel time reductions from meta-studies of practice. And we also measured them in relation to travel time. So we've been able to help the industry understand the types of benefits you get from this. We changed the model of how you think about bus priority and tram priority. This was the prevailing model in the Transit Cooperative Research Program publication on bus rapid transit. They theorized, this was the old theory, that you get travel time benefits from getting the buses to be faster, that you get some kinds of travel time savings from passengers up to, only a few minutes. But then afterwards, between 5 and 3 minutes, you get some operating cost savings as the buses get faster and you get more service out of buses. More kilometres can be run every hour. And after about 5 minutes, you get some mode share effects where people stop using buses or cars and they start using the bus because it's more attractive. You get a mode share effect. And they also theorise that after about 9 or 10 minutes, you get some benefits from land use change because these modes are so much more attractive. Well, that was the old model. When we came along, we actually wrote a paper with Margit Sarvi, who was here last week, which is a new model, which is reconceptualizing this to be more accurate. Okay? In our model, we've got travel time savings. We measure it as a percentage. And the previous model said we'll only get, small savings for passengers. But in practice, we can get passenger travel time savings don't plateau at 2 or 3 minutes. We, as previous evidence has shown, we've got some travel time savings of up to 46% in big busways, so they keep on going. Also, rather than having mode shift effects, which start at 5 minutes, mode shift can occur at very, very low levels and keep on going. It's a linear, and it's an addition to passenger travel time savings. It's not a threshold where we suddenly stop getting one benefit and another. These are continuous. The previous model was very limited, and also we get operating cost savings and then land use benefits. So we conceptualize the way of getting benefits from bus priority, tram priority, in a different way, which is much more accurate. A very big innovation we found this consistently in research, is that bus priority lanes save lives. Yeah, around planet Earth, you will not find anybody putting in bus lanes in cities with a view of saving life. But we found that bus lanes significantly reduce road deaths. There was a 66% drop in off-path incidents during provision of bus lanes, 28% in rear-end accidents as buses in traffic often have interactions with cars. There was a 50% drop in side collisions. And this has all been published. And these days, if you're a good administration, when you put in bus lanes, you should be recognizing that road safety is going to be significantly better. We also created an entirely new methodology for evaluating bus lanes. We included the passenger transport growth resulting from better public transport and the reductions in traffic caused by that, which would actually help with traffic flow. It's common for traffic engineers in cities to see bus lanes as taking away space, which is going to create traffic congestion, but in fact it also reduces traffic, and you need to include that. We also reconceptualized bus lanes in some of our research. We said that cities are trying to achieve different things from their policies. For example, here in Zhuzhou, car dominates everywhere, and the only transit they have probably in Jeju is for social needs. There's groups in the community out there probably haven't got a bus, which is why we have a bus network. But you could still have priority for those buses as long as it doesn't really affect traffic. Subservient priority, of course. Some cities believe that the car's got no future and that transit must replace cars for all those cities because cars are so inefficient. Hong Kong doesn't give a lot of priority for cars because it just doesn't make any sense, because mass transit is the carrier. In those sorts of cities, the types of priority they will give you would be right-of-way a tunnel, just for the transit system, or right-of-way B, a separate right-of-way, often with intersections with traffic. But if they do have mixed traffic right-of-way C context, it's always at extremely high levels of priority, where traffic control systems will let the buses go through. And in the middle here, there are cities that only really want public transport systems for the peak, because everybody recognizes in the peak the cars are inefficient and we should be carrying people on public transport. The type of priority you would have for this is peak-only priority. So we reconceptualized the types of contexts where you might put public transport priority systems. And there are some of the publications that our work has come up with, some innovations. But you need to understand, folks, that you're only a small cog in a big wheel of things that are going on in the world. All right? You're writing research papers that would help science, is read by researchers. People in the real world don't often know much about research. They don't know what's going on. They often don't have time. You know, traffic engineers at the local level, traffic planners in local government areas, they don't often read research. They are governed by the politics of the real world. And this is Melbourne. It's a picture of a street in Melbourne. Melbourne has the largest tram system in the world. Many cities are trying to get light rail vehicles like this. This is a modern European light rail vehicle, 3 or 4 million Australian dollars worth. And it's sitting on its tracks in the middle of a road full of traffic. There are more people on that tram in all of that traffic, okay? But it doesn't get any priority because it is hard in democracies to justify to politicians why we should change the road. There's too much real world opposition to change in cities that are dominated by cars, because a lot of the cars are voters, and getting change is very hard in practice. So in some ways, all of the science and engineering research we've been doing for the last 20 years, the innovations we've come up with don't really matter that much. We can't change the world because it's too hard. But we decided to do this research project to find a way to do that, to create actual change in cities. Yeah. So we did it through starting off by trying to understand how policies really are changed in cities, how cities make their decisions, legitimacy. It's one thing to say, well, this is what a city street looks like with cars, very congested, same number of people. If we had one bus, we'd probably be able to use all that space. It's much more efficient, or bikes. It's one thing to say it's obviously space efficient for big cities to use public transport, but that doesn't help you necessarily if a lot of people drive. They all still want to keep on driving, and they are voters. And these days, implementation is very difficult. During COVID, we had a lot of movement towards cycling lanes to allow people to cycle in cities. Now COVID is over, traffic's returning. We're finding there's more car people are complaining about that. They want their bike lanes gone so they can drive their cars more. In one part of Melbourne, we were trying to build some new tram stops for disabled people so they could, in their wheelchairs, use the stop to get on and off the trams. And one of the local councils said, no, we're not going to allow that because cyclists would be affected by that, and we want the cyclists to be able to drive. And so there was this was a protest where these disabled people literally got in the middle of the road, stopped all the traffic, and said, we're protesting because you won't give us access to our trams. So we have people protesting about outcomes, conflicting their views about what the future would be. Now, the reason these people were protesting was because there is a law in Australia that says they have a right to access. It's called the Disability Discrimination Act. And this is what countries do to make things legitimate. We have laws. In Australia, the law says that by 2032, I think, every single tram, bus, and rail station has to be accessible to disabled people. It's the law. So what was happening is the tram company was matching the law by building the stops, but the local council disagreed with that. They said they didn't want to have that. So this is what we call normative legitimacy. A norm has been set by the law, and you can then make change by having a law. But there's also legitimacy through reasonableness. These are all defined terms. Some people with no wheelchair access, like driving a bike, might think it's unreasonable for them to not be able to ride a bike near a tram stop. Then there's legitimacy as trust. Transport engineers try and find solutions, and we trust the engineer to come up with answers that we would like. So they recommended a platform stop here. Do we trust them? Are they legitimate because they're the experts? Then there's something called sociological legitimacy. There's widespread support that people think that disabled people should have access like everybody else. And so a common person in the street might say, well, you know, we should let them have that. But some people disagree with that. There's legitimacy through consent. We could have voted. We could have said, all right, we'll have a vote. Everybody will vote to see whether we agree with this, and the majority will go with that. Then there's something called unconditional duty is another way to be legitimate. Cyclists must always have a bike lane, but if they have a bike lane, we can't have a platform stop. Then there's something called conditional normative support. Hey, I agree with the disability discrimination. I agree with bike lanes, but I don't want to lose off-street parking as a common view. Some people have a view, but they make it conditional on another view. So there's different ways of looking at all of these problems and making decisions in practice. So this research we were doing was asking the question, how can we make change in cities when it's hard to do it? How can we make change? We came up with a lot of things, and I'm going to try and lead you through them. But one of the things we came up with is a way to map legitimacy of transport projects in your city. It's a very simple map. It's a graph. This is how legitimate things are. Very highly legitimate or not legitimate at all. And this is the degree of sustainable transport. In this case, bus priority, tram priority provided. It's a very simple map. What it says is the starting point of the map is this is how much priority we've got for trams and buses. And this is where we are. It's how legitimate it is. The starting point. We might think we want to increase the priority, that we think it's more legitimate to be here. And if everybody agrees with that, we'll then provide it. Implementation is what's provided. Some people might complain and decrease that. They might think, well, actually, I think you're wrong. I think we're more legitimate down here. You should be going there. Or we could take it away. There's plenty of examples of streets where people have changed it for good reasons. People complained and it was all taken away. So the failure removal. Or we might have, in this case at 4, we might have said, okay, but actually we think it's worthwhile keeping it. We actually keep it there. We persuade people that it is legitimate. So there's a task in all cities when we're undertaking policy to persuade people about what should happen. Many of you might think there's some kind of scientific answer. No, there's not. It's all politics, everywhere. Even in non-democracies, even in China, places like that, the policymakers have to be aware of what the people in the public think. It's always going to be an influence. Let me take you through an example of these. The research we did was all case study work. This is centre of Melbourne. This is the centre of Melbourne here. And there are some tram routes here, working here. Here we had 3 stops. This is what the stops looked like on Nicholson Street. These were, the platform is on the road. When the tram comes, people have to step up onto the platform, so they're not accessible for disabled people. That's where we started off. It was what's called a safety zone stop. It's what was considered legitimate, and it's the amount of priority provided was very little. It was very poor quality and very slow for trams to get through. The disability discrimination map, it's an example of the legitimacy through legislation, said, oh, we have to provide a platform stop. So the legislation made it legitimate. We're going to provide it. They came up with a design. This is experts did some work. Classic consulting engineers went in and designed some platform tram stops for the area. This was designed. There was public consultation to gain legitimacy with the local community, with some surveys said, hey, we're going to do this in this area. What do you think of that? And they were asked to see whether they agreed or not. And then people agreed with that generally. And the policy was made to build them. And there's the same stop now. It's got a platform there, and you've got the tram running here, and disabled people can get on and off it. It's a bit of extra priority here for the tram as well. This is curbing to stop traffic getting in the way. So the trams go a little bit faster. And so that's what happened there. This is an example of the world is great. We made things legitimate by consulting with the public, and then we provided the priority, okay? But up the street, same street, there's the whole set of other stops that we wanted to convert. The story there was we started off with what's called a curbside stop, where the stop's there, the tram arrives, people walk across the road, very dangerous it is, and they step up to the tram, not accessible for disabled people. The Disability Discrimination Act came in, they wanted level boarding, but the Greens councillors in the local area said, well, you can't do that because the bikes can't get through. The bikes will not be able to get onto the road. So they stopped the project. But there was a protest. Here's the people protesting. And as a result of that, a new design was created. This was activism in the local area. And then the government stepped in and we created a design which both is a raised roadway here, where the cyclists can drive along, cycle along, but it ends up with a flat road for the flat area platform for the stop. So a solution was given by interaction of the issues. So the work we were doing in this research project was trying to map how decisions were made in practice, how outcomes came about in practice through legitimacy. Okay? And what we did is we did a whole bunch of case studies around different cities around the world that achieved great outcomes by looking at alternative outcomes. One of the great cities in the world for public transport priority on road is Curitiba in Brazil, where they have busways right down the center of the city, very high speed, very high design. We were asking the question, how did they do that? How did they go about, how did they implement this in practice when we can't implement some of our priority measures in our city? What was the trick that they had that did this? When we looked at the literature, the people involved in it said that it was power that mattered in that city that created that outcome. Certainly much more than political will. It was the who was in charge to make that power. And in Brazil, they have a military dictatorship. Yes, they have the military government that decides this, and that's the power there. And in fact, the busway came about through a very wide range of outcomes. In history, it all started with the idea that downtown in the CBD of Curitiba, they would have a shopping mall, a pedestrianised area. The mayor of the town said, let's do that. It's a great idea. Unfortunately, none of the traders, very powerful people in the local area, agreed with that. They wanted to have cars. They drove cars. They wanted cars everywhere. So what the mayor did was, he didn't tell them what he was going to change the city centre. He did it, he went a different path. Rather than trying to become legitimate and then providing it, he decided he was going to go this path. He's actually going to go and provide the outcome first, because if they had a chance to actually see it, everyone would love it. It's a very different strategy, a very brave strategy, if you see what I mean. They're going to try and do something and people might well object. So he was clever about it. What he did was he had all his teams ready to implement this design over a weekend. They started work on Friday after the courts had closed, so that nobody could get the courts to ban it until Monday. So the roads were suddenly closed. The new mall was built over the weekend when all the courts were closed and none of the traders could actually stop it. There were armed police presence. Don't forget, this is a military dictatorship. And the mayor had the support of the governor. No use of force was needed, but there were policemen there. the mayor had the backing of the state government. So they built this mall in a weekend, and nobody stopped them. Actually, during this period, there was lots of interaction with the local traders who were complaining. The retailers went straight to the governor and said, you've got to stop this. You've got to sack this mayor because he's gone and done this without talking to us. The governor said, yeah, I'll talk to you. I'm going to talk to you in 30 days. The mayor said, well, why don't we have a 30-day trial? If it doesn't work, okay. So the mall started developing from that, and what do you know, the traders suddenly found it. They increased their trade. People liked it. Business increased. The trial was a great success. The mall then expanded. And then they did it more and more. So this is an example of, through political power, of being a military dictatorship, of clever mayorship, of actually doing it over a weekend, doing it astutely. In fact, during this, there were some protests from the traders, and the traders were going to have a drive-through where they're going to go through all the barriers in their cars to complain. And the mayor created a weekend party for children in the area. And suddenly the traders had to drive their car through children's parties. They didn't do that. It was a very clever way of the mayor trying to understand and manage the situation. In the end, the traders liked it, and it's still there. They kept it. Why is that important to the future of the busway? Because what happened was the mayor had had a great success with the mall. He used it to suggest, well, let's have a bus rapid transit system in our city instead of chaotic bus services. He provided it, it was successful, and they kept on providing it, and that's how a busway was created in a Brazilian city, because some decision makers implemented things before they got legitimacy from the population. Could it have happened everywhere? No. Could it have only happened in a military dictatorship? Maybe. But that's how it was done. Okay, so legitimacy was created through a whole set of political outcomes. Right. So what did we do with this research? We had some very different contexts and outcomes from two examples. What we did was we started looking at case studies around the world of really great outcomes from transit priority in cities. And we asked the question, how did Zurich, transport planning in Zurich, traffic engineering in Zurich is all about the trams. The traffic engineers in Zurich don't sit about thinking about the cars and then, well, how much time are we going to take from the trams? They plan the trams first, and the second thing they look at is the trams, is the cars. The cars are secondary, and that's their policy. How was it their policy? How does they get away with it and nobody else gets away with it? We also looked at lots of other examples which were seen to be good in Boston, where outcomes were created that were positive. And we asked ourselves, well, how was it made possible? What happened to create the outcome, the legitimacy? And from this work, we realized this pattern of what's legitimacy, how you go about creating legitimacy, and then outcomes is very different according to road user impacts, affecting other road users, particularly the car. There are parts of where you change policy where you don't affect the car. And I'll talk about those. But when you're affecting the car, you're in this area and you've got to have a different strategy. You'll get the idea in a second. I'm not going to lead you through all the case studies and how we came to the end. I'm going to now get to the end. I'm going to tell you what we found. We came up with 9 ways to change the world. Okay? And this is sort of like a menu for cities. If you want to change your city and you're finding it hard to do it politically, adopt some of these strategies. So I'm going to go through them so you can see how they work. There are 3 groups. Approach A, you're going to try and build legitimacy first, and then you're going to have a project. Group B is you're going to create a project in this area or that area. And you get legitimacy because there's no conflict. You're not affecting cars, and there won't be opposition. So you can do projects here. And actually those projects almost entirely don't influence cars, such as build a tunnel. You build a tunnel where you put your train down or your buses down, not affecting any cars. You can build a bridge and grade separate the problem. It's expensive, but you can do it. The third strategy group is strategy group C, where you are brave and you will build the project first and worry about legitimacy after that. Just like the mayor of Currie did. And there's a way of doing that. And in fact, group C is being used all the time. It's just nobody's ever really realized it yet. Okay, let's go through them. Let's start by building legitimacy before implementation. This is where we build legitimacy first, and then we implement this thing. The first of these, that's the second group, which is avoiding impacts by being in this area or that area. And the third group is that, where you build first, and then that's the brave way you go. Okay, pragmatic strategies. Let's start with the first one. These are building legitimacy before you implement. The first is a technical inquiry. Get some experts involved. They do environmental impact assessments of projects and then tell everybody what the outcomes are. In the context of my city, the road authority has a suite of tools that they often take to the public, where they use geographical mapping and simple diagrams to explain the results of transport modeling so that people can understand what happens when changes are made, and that can be used to convince people. You're building legitimacy by using technical evidence. Lots of transport consultants do this. They're using the science you guys come up with, but they're as tools, and then they're using them as tools to give evidence, expert evidence, if you like. Another way of doing it, this is just transport planning. It's another version of the same thing, usually at a higher level. In Melbourne, we had a whole bunch of strategies, which I was involved in. Melbourne 2030, we were involved in Toronto. My group was involved in Toronto in reviewing the big move by Metrolinx. They had a huge amount of planning studies saying that we need to improve transit, we need to have more priority, and these become political documents which parties adopt as their manifesto in elections, and they become part of what you're allowed to build. So there's a transport planning approach, if you like. Currie did this. As part of their plan, after they'd been successful with the MAL, the mayor said, let's have a plan for the city. We'll try and change the city around a busway, and we can make the whole city work better. It's a planning-based approach. And they created this whole network where they had one successful corridor, and they kept on building on it. You know, success builds on success. Third approach, public processes and hearings. When you've got conflict, people say they don't want this, some people say they want it, you can have a public hearing. What happens with a public hearing? You have people coming in, and you have a process, often a judicial process, where a judge, an impartial person, judges, and everybody gets their say. It's part of the process. Everybody has to have their say. And then decisions are made on the technical outcomes of that. Why does that work? Well, because it's not political. No politicians are involved. It's technical. People are allowed to have their say at all sides. Great example, this is, of taking it to the nth level, is Zurich. Zurich were thinking of building a metro. They didn't want that, but they were then saying, well, if we can't have a metro, can we do something to make our trams better by having trams priority as the way of dealing traffic engineering in their city? And so they had a vote where the citizens of the city could vote between having this strategy for trams to have priority or not. And the outcome was extremely close, a bit like Brexit. 51% voted for it. And that became the plan, because the city had voted for it. It was a public process where it was voted on, and now all the traffic engineers are entirely legitimately allowed to plan for trams first and traffic second. What about avoiding impacts on other users? There's lots of this around the world. I've seen it in Korean cities. Grade separation is the obvious one. What do? This is an example from Toronto, where Toronto had a very progressive strategy of light rail development. A new mayor came in with a different political point of view. He said he wasn't going to have all these tram routes, but one of them had already been built, or was being built. He said, all right, well, I'll put the money to make all this tram underground so my cars can go fast enough, because he was a very pro-car mayor. So to avoid the problems, he spent the money to put the trams underground. And Toronto had already been doing this for a long time. Here's central Toronto, there's the metro, there's one of the tram lines. It runs on street out here, street running. And then when it gets towards the city centre, there's a portal, the tram goes underground. And it avoids, in these sections, all this traffic area. Not very nice, but it is a very efficient way of running the tram. It's really expensive, but it avoids any conflict. If you've got the money, you can do it. Also, they transfer underground. Lots of advantages underground in certain environments, such as cold environments or too hot. What about building new capacity? The best example is not necessarily this. This is a freeway in Melbourne, and the buses are allowed to use the emergency stopping lane to travel along. So they get priority, but it doesn't affect the cars. It's what I call subservient priority. So there's no objection to that really, because who's losing out? There, a very common approach in Australia to building bus lanes is to actually widen the road one extra lane width so you can put the buses there. And who's going to object to that? It's expensive, but no cars are badly affected. So that's another way. You build new capacity rather than taking it away from the car. Another is something called subservience. This is priority which doesn't affect anybody. A good example is Currie built these boxes, which are effectively subway platforms for the buses. So what you do is you go in the turnstile, it's all actually air conditioned. You go in the turnstile and you're waiting there for the bus. Okay, and the bus arrives, but you've already paid your fare because you've gone in this box. So you can just walk straight on the bus. You do that on a subway or automatically. But what's happening is rather than the bus waiting for you to pay the fare, it goes much quicker. There's some other examples. Hook turns in Melbourne are a good example of how you would move traffic out of the way of trams to get them priority, but still give them the same sort of priority. They're a way of getting traffic, instead of turning in front of a tram in the centre of the road, to turn on the side of the road. Another is turn bans. Traffic that gets in the way of tram would not be allowed to make that manoeuvre. It doesn't really affect the traffic too much and is good for public transport. All right, what about this difficult one? The hard one, building legitimacy through actually doing stuff, okay? Well, the first is something called bottom-up and incremental. And this goes on all the time. People just don't notice it. And that's the trick of this. You do it slowly over time. Here's an example of a tram in Fitzroy Street, St Kilda. There's the tram, there's the road. One day, one of the traffic engineers did this. There was no public inquiry. There was no people in the media. He just painted some lines. There's the road. He just painted these lines here. Frankly, nobody really noticed. Okay? There you go, there's a bit of priority. Yeah. Then, a little bit later on, some money was found. We're going to put some trees in. It's going to look nice, isn't it? No inquiry, nobody really noticed. Some people said, oh, that looks nice. And so the traffic's now over here. So what's happened is we've gone from this, where the traffic can get very close to the trams and get in the way and people do U-turns, we've gone to this. It's a revolution in priority, okay? Nobody noticed, nobody complained, there was no strategy, there was no plan, nobody ever said it was going to happen this way. Now you might think, well, that's a couple of examples, but in the last 10 years, Melbourne CBD, which is the biggest tram system in the world, this has gone on everywhere. Nobody complained. It took 10 years of slow bits of traffic engineering to change things. And priority has now been almost entirely provided on all routes in Melbourne CBD. There was no strategy. Nobody complained. There was no public consultation. It was just done by largely traffic engineers doing sensible things for trams. Here's a good example of one. This is one of the biggest tram stops in Melbourne. I used to work in this building. It's the tallest tower. It's a big it's a special stop for disabled people. It was built for Disability Discrimination Act legislation. It thins the lanes for traffic down here, and pedestrians get right of way in city centres, as they should do. Traffic shouldn't have right of way in city centres. It's people that's important. And trams, because they carry more people. But when they put these things in, the traffic engineers did this. They put all these barriers in. In fact, if you look at the other end of the stop, you'd see there's a strip of concrete all the way here, which is quite a little bit higher to allow pedestrians to wait there. That's got nothing to do with disability legislation. The traffic engineers changed the street over time to make it easier for the trams. Nobody complained. There was no plan. Nobody made a decision to do it. No politician was involved. Nobody in the public complained. But it was done slowly over time. What about, this is an interesting new set of things that are going on. This is happening now on planet Earth, okay? Pop-ups. What's a pop-up? This is a suburb of Boston. This is a street. For years, they've been trying to get a bus lane on this street. The mayor of the local town got his traffic engineer in on Friday evening, and he said, go and take the witches' hats out on Monday. I want you to create the bus lane there using witches' hats on Monday morning. Don't talk to anybody about it, just do it. Pop-up bus lane. But he did it in a clever way. He actually had he was ready for the people who were going to complain about it. People said, so you can't do that, you can't do that. We have. And he also did surveys of the bus users that week, and also surveyed bus travel time. And when the media came to him with all these complaints, he said, oh, actually, they've seen the benefits we've got from this. He had a story ready. In fact, we were doing this research, and we were at TRB, and we saw a great session at TRB, something called tactical transit lanes. Some people have been assembling evidence of where people have actually gone in and provided priority with no strategy, just by doing it themselves. Now, great thing about this, it can all go wrong. There can be somebody here that's got some kind of legal representation, goes to court, you've got to take it away. A witch's hats, you can take them away in 2 minutes. So the risks are quite small here. Yeah, you might get some bad press, be aware for it. This is democracy, people will complain, but also try and make sure there's a voice for the people that benefit from it. Here's a really new development in it, which I think is lovely, fantastic idea. This really happened. There's a photograph of it. Some cycling advocates this is Seattle, I think. Seattle, yeah. They wanted to have a bike lane. So this is what we call a guerrilla road safety group. What they did is, one night they got together, they knew about how to change roads, and they all got their hats on. They went out and they constructed this lane. They didn't tell anybody they were going to do it. They had no authorization to do it. None of the authorities knew it was going to happen. The police looked at it, didn't know what was going on. And the Monday morning, there they were, put out there. The public built their own priority for bikes. What happened was, The authorities didn't freak out. They were very, very careful about it because the public had seen it and thought, God, that's clever. What they did was they, in fact, the authorities said, look, no one's done any road safety assessments of that. It shouldn't be happening. They took it down, but they were careful to collect all the materials and they give it back to them so they could do it again in the future. And in fact, they did an inquiry and the bike lane's there. So they actually got it in practice. They were reasonably polite about the whole thing and they accepted that there was a need. So there you go. These are the 9 strategies you can trial. The next one is trials. Trials. This is a tale of King Street in Toronto, a very, very high frequency tram route. They wanted to make the trams better on that street, the downtown plan. But the businesses were kind of reluctant to do that. They didn't want to give any priority to the trams because it would affect their parking for their businesses, lots of restaurants. So there's a conflict between local traders and the transit company. There was a strategy to try and improve the visioning of the feature of the street, but recognizing the role for trams, but they were conflicting with each other. You know, traffic, trams, parking, getting in the way. Some people were saying that, you know, transit priority would affect the quality of the street. So the council proposed a trial, King Street trial. Okay, so a trial was proposed and put in place. Signs went up. This is a trial. We're just going to trial it all. Why was it a trial? Because you can try it, see if it works, and if it doesn't, you know, take it away. You know, we never do that. We don't do enough of this. We don't try things. We assume that what's there is right. So they did a trial. A lot of people protested. They took the parking away, and these are all Torontonites doing their ice hockey game in the winter. And they used to play ice hockey on the game to slow trams down. Some traders, such as the restaurants who objected to it, put some art together, including some ice art. You can see what that's saying. It's telling them what they think for the trams. But then some people complained that the trial wasn't being successful. The mayor said, listen, this is a pilot. We haven't got it right. We'll try and change it around. So the mayor created a strategy to try and get more activity in the place as part of the trial. You know, can we do something to help the traders do a bit better? It was winter and it was a downturn then, economic downturn, so maybe that was part of the problem. The mayor tried to do something. One thing they decided to do, which was very influential, was they started to create a leaflet about what was happening on the street. So everybody involved knew what was going on. It's very nicely designed, this. You could see what was happening to transit travel times and also travel time reductions and ridership and how the reliability was improved, what the transit travel times were, what was happening to pedestrian volumes, the economic point of sale data was happening to the traders. It was a way of telling everybody how the trial was going because people were just complaining from their point of view. Well, I don't like this whole thing, so I think it's terrible. They weren't using evidence. So they provided objective evidence. And they started putting these in the box. This is how it's going so far. And then suddenly the stories in the media were, hey, it's okay. It's going all right now. There was actually complaints that the trial might end. People are starting to think, oh, when it ends, if they take it away, it might not be as good as it is now. So they voted to keep it. So it's a trial where they tried something out and they found that it worked. But the mayor, if you notice carefully, did a good job of was trying to address some of the problems. They were using the trial is we're trying to find a way to do it well. And he also provided really solid information people could base their decision on. Now, in our case studies, we looked at a case in Melbourne where a trial was put in place in a place called Clarendon Street. It was the first strategy of a project the government put in place called Think Tram policy. I was part of the whole thing. I was in the meetings, and their first trial was somewhere called Clarendon Street. And they said it was a trial, but a lot of the local traders didn't believe them. They said, oh yeah, it's a trial, but I bet you any money they're going to do it anyway. So they didn't have any credibility really. Also, Yarra Trams, the tram operator, I remember seeing this go out and thinking, this was their data given to the local public about how the trams were getting better. I don't know about you, but I can't understand it still. It's as a means of communicating to mums and dads who lives in the area. What they're going to go, what does that say? What is it? It's not a way of communicating. Whereas the Toronto one was beautifully simple. People could understand the whole thing. Also, this is tram operating speeds. What about economic vitality? What about the performance of the businesses? That's what they want to know. So that I don't think it was very well managed. But some of those things, compared to Toronto, they've really done a good job of understanding, explaining it to people. All right, so where are we? From all of that work, we seem to have developed these 9 ideas for how you could try and create change in cities, dealing with democratic issues, dealing with opposition from people, really largely dealing with the issue that dominates all transport planning in planet Earth today. And the dominant issue in transport planning today is that the car dominates everything. We all seem to have this view that cars are the answer to cities, and they're certainly not. We need to manage the car better, but politically it's extremely difficult. I can tell immediately from my time in South Korea that you are dominated by the car. Your thinking is entirely dominated by it. Your politics are dominated by it. We really need to start planning cities away from that. These are ways we can achieve outcomes in a more acceptable way in cities that will get those cities to work better. And they achieve all the normacy and legitimacy ideas using these approaches. Now, this research is all in James's PhD, if you're interested in it. That's all available online. These are some of the diagrams we used mapping out outcomes in cities from this. One cool innovation from this is we later on started changing this to look at relief landscapes in cities, because some outcomes are harder and they have a natural tendency to move towards normalcy. So we reconceptualized this model actually as a landscape, three-dimensional landscape. Now, it's been very hard to publish this work because it's very complex case study work. There is a case study journal, but I'm trying to get some impact on this. We did do a few conference papers, and we've devoted our latest book is the Edward Elgar series of handbooks, and it's the Handbook of Public Transport Research. They asked us to publish this research handbooks in transport, and we have a chapter 10, overviewing James's thesis and the strategies that develop new approaches and insight to how to manage this problem. And that's where we're from. Now, we've got 2 episodes of the Researching Transit podcast. On this, episode 2, which is James going through his work, and also Andrew Nash, one of the European American transport planners, looking at priority in Zurich and how that was achieved. And that's it from me, and there's the team. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Grant. It's really insightful talk. I was really fascinated by the fact that you look at the kind of all the legitimacy and implementation of the Boston transit system by looking at all the case studies. So we're going to have a Q&A session. So I'm going to take some questions from the audiences. So if you have any questions, raise your hand, please. All right, go ahead.
It was really nice. It was really interesting topic. And my question is, does all these approaches, do they apply to any size of any city size? Or it's like maybe
question.
some of them are easier, maybe other things more difficult?
Yeah. A simple answer is it's very different according to city size. The bigger the city, the easier it is to do these things, because the case for transit priority is always stronger. You know, the case for transit priority in central Hong Kong, why are you even giving lanes to traffic? You know, it's usually very wealthy people in those vehicles. And actually their travel times are terribly long. Whereas next door is subways, massive capacity, also bus systems carrying many hundreds of people in those vehicles. It just makes absolute sense in those cities. Smaller American towns, a real problem. The transit logic in those towns is entirely social. It's a bit like the graphic I gave at the very beginning. Here for a while, too many slides. This is a model we created to try and answer your question, is which context does priority work better? And it's a conceptualization which hasn't been done before. Come on, you can do it, you can do it. It's this model here. It says cities where transit replaces car for virtually all trips, that's where we're doing. That's Hong Kong. You know, Hong Kong does allow traffic, but it's transit that does the job because you couldn't run Hong Kong without it. There, the solution is right away A, which is fully segregated transit systems, metros. Or right away B, busways. And if you're going to be in mixed traffic at all, like your buses, they're going to have wonderful priority. And that's what they have in Hong Kong. If you're a small town American city in a very small area, your transit system, its purpose is not this. It's not to replace the car. You couldn't, you know. And why would you want to? There's no transit in those cities, there's very little. Its purpose is only for social purposes. It's there for the few population that don't have a car. In those cases, you can still have priority, but it doesn't make any sense to really affect the car in those areas. And that's why you can still have subservient priority, which is priority. A good example is passive traffic signal priority. Signal priority, there's lots of types of signal priority. One is just to literally sequence the lights in a different way. If your bus route's going down this street, you get a little bit more green time for that movement. That's a passive movement. It doesn't recognize the buses there. It's just you're giving a little bit more time. So on average, the bus will get more time. And that doesn't really influence the rest of the traffic. They hardly notice it, passive. So there are many ways of this. And in the middle is most cities, to be honest. I think Seoul's here. I think Seoul should be doing that all the time. I'm a bit concerned in Seoul how much time is given to traffic in that area. And I think you should be doing a lot more than just having bus lanes in the middle of the street. Most cities are in this area. They don't really have their transit system for mass travel. They're really just worried about the peak period. And you can have only peak period lanes. Some cities have bus lanes just for the peak because they know in that time you should be giving priority. So that answers your question with that model. It says it's different according to the size of the city, exactly as your question.
Thank you very much.
No worries.
Any other question from the audience? Go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you, Professor Currie. So I have read some studies regarding the impact of COVID-19.
Yes.
So I think there are work from home will be a very common phenomenon, especially in Australia. There are many studies regarding this issue. And also there are some studies indicating that they found that people start to shift from the shared mode, for example, the public transit, back to the private mode.
Yep.
So do you think it will be the challenge for the future public transit?
Yeah. Okay. So that's correct. Globally, at the moment, transit systems are on average at about 85% of their ridership they were pre-COVID. They've come back a bit more. Our research shows very clearly that COVID-19 will result in a long-term effect on ridership, a one-off decline of ridership of the order of 10 to 15% is what we now think. We used to think it was 20, but it's changed. People's perceptions of COVID have changed. 2 drivers working from home. Working from home was very, very high, and then it's come down. And we think there'll be more working from home after COVID than there was before. But that effect is wearing off a little, because some people can't work from home, some people don't want to work from home, some people do, but it will have an effect. The other factor affecting that is infection fear. In Hong Kong, Taiwan, I'm not sure about Korea, but I'm sure you would have had this. During SARS, there was lots of infection fear, reduced transit ridership. But afterwards, after SARS was gone, there was no effect on ridership. Ridership went straight back again. But in COVID, our early research, we're not at the end of COVID, so it's still out there, but our early research suggests there will be a COVID effect, and it will be long lasting. So there is an effect. It's a one-off effect, which creates a reduction, but over time, all transit markets, all transport markets change. At the moment, transit ridership is recovering because of fuel prices. That's nothing to do with COVID. It's a natural progression of fuel prices because of the Ukraine war. That's affected all prices, and cars have become less attractive. A big thing for Australia is that we've got growth in our populations. In West Australia, we're doing a study in Perth. They had no ridership decline because their population grew during COVID. Their employment grew, so they are getting less riders as a share of travel, but all travel grew. So their effect was very small. Now, globally, cities are growing. Megacities in particular, over 10 million, are getting more and more. In fact, we're going to increase the rate of them. More Asian-style cities, frankly, around the world. New York's a bit like it, actually. And that will continue. Urbanization has been the path of planet Earth. Since 2007, the majority of the world's population now lives in cities. So cities are, in fact, the dominant way of living in the world now. Those cities are getting denser and they're getting larger. Yes, there's a one-off effect of COVID. It's not a positive thing. I don't know about any of you, but I didn't think COVID was very positive. We had the longest lockdowns in Melbourne in Western world, I think. And I was literally at home for a year and a half, I think. It's terrible. But it's a one-off. While growth is occurring, in Melbourne, our transit ridership doubled in 10 years because of population growth and so forth. So a 10 to 15% effect when we get back to population growth will be erased within 5 years, easily. So will public transport be important for the future of the world? Completely will be. Whether there's a COVID effect is just not big enough. The simple fact is you can't have cities and cars. They cannot continue at the rate that we're going. They are congested. I don't care what traffic engineering solutions you've got for cities. They're making marginal differences while they're growing and they're getting worse and congestion's getting worse and worse. The only answer for cities, in my view, is public transport systems at high quality. Do we have good public transport systems? No. No. So we're not really investing in the way we should do for cities, I think. Does that help?
Any other question? We're going to have a last question from the audience.
Okay. I have a very, is it personal? My question is from the personal curiosity. It's because why the people do the implementation first. In Korean government, we made an annual budget in transportation area or road construction area, but and normally in the end of the year, we try to rebuild or replace the pavement or pedestrian road, even though it doesn't need to be replaced. The reason why they need to spend the budget first because next year, when they ask the government to give them money, if they didn't spend enough budget last year and they get a penalty instead of getting a compliment. So what about the other countries' situation?
Well, that's a tactical, it's not a strategic plan, it's a tactical things government do sometimes. It happens to all governments, even in democracies or, non-democracies, they all have a problem with the management of money, and sometimes budgets don't work out because the real world's really complicated. Now think about your budget, how you manage your finances. Does your finances work perfectly every month and you always get exactly the same amount that you would expect at the month and you spend exactly the same amount? The real world is really complicated and governments are just like that. And things sometimes change, and so they're left with this problem. And central governments often are managing the relationship of funds, and if they say they've got more funds than necessary, they start thinking, we give you too much money. So yeah, technically governments sometimes make a decision to do that. Now, and they could then make a point decision to implement something. But I bet you they're not implementing anything that's controversial. In particular, as I've said, the dominant world power in transport planning is the car. Some theorists call this the predict and provide theory. It's dominated the way of transport planning for the last century. We've been saying we need predicting more traffic and providing more road space. We've been building more roads, and that's been increasing the amount of cars, and we've been doing that forever. Transport planning's been dominated by the whole thing. And as a result of this, we're now in a situation where governments don't want to ever stop doing that, but they're going to have to start doing this to get more efficient cities. So I don't think they're making any controversial decisions against the car. They're probably putting it on something which people no one will complain about. Yeah.
Thank you. Just one question, Currie. I think you talked about the building public transit system that's involved in kind of dealing with all the social, environmental, legal issues. I think you talked about American cities, like a small town.
Yes.
These communities actually oppose the building this kind of public transit system for long. It's simply because they don't like the high density development.
Yeah.
They don't like the public transit going into their community.
Yes.
So how would you view this? Handling these issues in other countries? And I think do they have the same process of dealing this issue, or do they go through the public hearing process as the same as others?
Well, I think it's only relevant to those contexts. And as I was saying before, these small towns this doesn't work as well for that. I'm afraid that they're going to be always small and always dealing with car traffic. And luckily the world is urbanizing, so it's going to become the exception. In fact, the American environment, it doesn't work very well. This doesn't work for the American environment much, apart from New York City, where this is exactly what should happen in New York City. But there are many growing cities, Los Angeles growing, and they're getting denser. But I don't think this works very well for those towns. How does it work in practice in those towns? Well, I think they've got a local population who doesn't want all that. They don't want density. But that's the minority of the world. The majority of the world is the big cities, because that's where people live now, and they're getting denser, and this problem becomes more and more what we need to do.